So Jillian Schleiden is also representing the University of Cambridge, and her talk today is entitled Different or Strokes for Different Folks, Exploring Student Interactions with Multiple Renditions of Aeneas's Visit to the Elysian Fields.
So my name is Jillian. I've actually been an English teacher in the Midwest in the States for the last several years, and then worked as a ghostwriter for some different publications that tend to do science fiction, obviously a lot of drawing and mythology. So something that I just have some interest in, but also, really enjoyed having the opportunity to investigate a little bit further here. So just to give some background on the study I completed most recently, I worked with a small group of students. They were taken from a GCSE, so like 15 and 16-year-olds Latin class at a local comprehensive school. So it's not fee paying. Anyone can enroll. They do have some tests to be admitted, but they're essentially competency tests. So a pretty mixed group. So it was 6 girls because it is an all girls school. And they, for their end of year exam for the GCSEs, if you don't know how they work, they have to read in Latin 6 short excerpts from the Aeneid as one of their literature assessments. So they do know in advance what those are. So they study them and they practice translating them ahead of time. So we focused on those excerpts all from book 6. And the excerpts are kind of in sequential order. When Aeneas and the Sibyl are first approaching the river in the underworld, whenever they're talking to Charon and saying, look, we have the golden bough, we can come across. Then again, whenever he first comes into the field, Lathe, where his father is with, of course, all of the future heroes to come. And then a very short excerpt of listing those heroes and how Caesar is going to bring about the golden age. So some select snippets from there, and that's mostly what we focused on. They did do these lessons with me. There was another teacher there because I'm not the normal teacher and I was visiting, but we did it in a separate classroom. I recorded it, so most of my data came from student creative work during the sessions and then from the transcriptions. And we just had 3-hour-long lessons, and they still needed to learn not necessarily the translation, but the content and some of the meaning of those different excerpts while we were working together as well. So some of my research decisions were much more focused on ensuring the quality of their learning and covering the material they were missing in class, and necessarily ahead of hitting all of the research questions I planned, because I think we always overplan maybe a little bit. We can't help it. So my main interest in doing this is that when I taught English in the States, I started teaching what's called AP, it's advanced placement. And there's no really curriculum for it. They basically just say, here are skills we expect students to have at the end of the year. Get them there however you want to. We do suggest they do some writing. We'd like them to read some classical texts. And that's really about it. And I was in a very high needs district. The majority of students receive free breakfast and lunch. So not a lot of money for resources. So kind of by product of elimination, what was already being used in other classes, we ended up using the Odyssey. And I was already interested in mythology, having worked with it as a writer before. But I realized that it is so hard to teach these ancient texts to modern students, especially if they don't have much of a background in it. So a lot of my interest in this research in particular was to find more efficient and effective ways to teach some of these classical studies, because I think students have background, especially from things like Percy Jackson. They have some of that information, but obviously, we study some of these things for terms and terms and terms. So it can be really difficult for a 16 or 17-year-old to read the Odyssey or read the Aeneid, much less just pieces of the Aeneid, and have a good idea what's going on, and something valuable to take with them at the end of the year. So the main motivations then were basically just looking at better ways to teach some of these things, hopefully, my own personal interest in the material, and then there's obviously some differences between the US and UK system, and the biggest one is that US teachers have a lot more control over their curriculum in particular. Most of the time, there don't tend to be set texts. Students are not all expected to read the same book. Part of that, though, means that fewer students tend to read classical texts a lot of the time. So kind of looking at what I found from this, because of course that's kind of the interesting takeaway. was I was actually really pleasantly surprised by how much background knowledge students had coming into reading the Aeneid. Some of it, of course, was from previous classes with their normal classroom teacher, but some of it was definitely just picked up out and about. Some really interesting examples for me were um, in the student version they had the very simple line for line translation they were using in class. It just said that at one point Hercules had tried to kidnap the guard dog of the underworld, and in the translations that I used, they all just say, well, Hercules stole Cerberus, the three-headed dog. And all of the students were just like, well, we know who Cerberus is. Why do we have this text in class that doesn't even mention his name? Like, we know his name. You don't have to tell us all these other things about him. They even knew what a phalanx was, which, surprised me a little bit. That's not something I know I would have known in high school. And it wasn't something they learned in class, but they talked about how some of the books that they like to read, some of the fiction references terms like that. And so they have gotten into it that way. So it was really nice to see how much background knowledge students have. And that I think, we can sometimes be guilty of underestimating what students know as well as what they're capable of. So to me, it kind of showed that you can give them a little bit more faith to know what's going on, but also to look into things. If they do need to gain more background knowledge, for the most part, they tend to be pretty good about seeking it out. The students compared the 4 different translations as we worked with them. And I gave students the time to talk and just discuss the translations for most of the sessions where we weren't doing creative activities to go over the content and the material of the different excerpts. And I was really impressed with the way that students justified their ideas about the text with examples from the different versions they were reading, and to see how they got into the different versions and could vocalize and express why they liked or didn't like certain translations, or what they thought was useful or not useful about them. So, for instance, they all liked the David West translation, which was a prose translation. And at first they said, well, it's kind of like a book. I like reading it because it's like how I normally read. But then they also said, well, it shows Charon like he really is. And that's an interesting thing to say. And I said, well, what do you mean by that? And they said, well, Charon's nice. Like, he'd probably be a lot friendlier if he hadn't been stuck in that boat forever like that. And I was really interested to see how they apply this very modern idea of characters existing in one concrete canonical form outside of their texts to these ancient texts. And so, looking at the different translations, they were pretty unhappy momentarily with the Seamus Heaney translation, which he translated just book 6, but they were not very excited whenever it described Charon as being unfriendly and surly and very focused on his job and is yelling at them to get away when they approach the boat. And so here, these were some different images that I've seen as I've been doing the research of Charon, where, he's traditionally described as sort of looking like a man, like an old man, but a man. And a lot of modern depictions in video games and art tend to show him more Grim Reaper-esque with, the robe and the skeleton, things like that. And then I thought, with that combination of cultural input, with the framework for that reception, my students, or the students I worked with, still came out saying, well, poor Charon, he really got the bad end of the deal here. Like, it's not his fault these people like Hercules and Theseus took advantage of him. He's just this nice guy doing his job. And I was really interested in the way they hung on to that interpretation of him, even as they read all of these different translations, and that was not sort of the standard image put forth by the translation. Students were also very reflective on how they might use the texts in class. So multiple of them said, well, I really liked the David West translation because I felt like I had a better understanding of what these words could mean in different ways in Latin, because of course words have different meanings. That's one of the huge difficulties of translation, even when you're not talking about Virgilian Latin. But they were able to say, well, this one by Sarah Rudin is fantastic for working on our translation because it's still in verse and it has that rhythm to it, and it uses this very, very concise prose. But the David West one really helped us to picture everything, have a better understanding of what all these different words could mean. They also had a lot more to say whenever they were working together. And, as a teacher, you can kind of tell, like, as they're one student doing the thinking and then they're all kind of regurgitating it. And I was impressed to see how they all sort of were fostering ideas off of each other and building out these ideas together. And kind of seeing these things happening in this small group obviously can't extrapolate out to like a universal application. Okay, let's see if I can get this to move forward. There we go. That kind of led me to, um, as a teacher, how I thought this would be beneficial taking out of this study to use in the classroom, and some benefits that I were hoping and did see there. And the first, of course, is that it's really easy to incorporate using the different translations, and there's lots of different ways to do that. Some ways that it would be easy to use in a Latin class where the focus is on language learning and historical learning would be just to give students time to read the different translations. Students refined their understanding by moving from one translation to the next, even before we started to really analyze them. And obviously, that's not a lot of prep time for a teacher to have to put those together, other than making the copies and sharing them and giving them a little reading time. And it wouldn't take a ton of class time for them to read them. I also thought it would be interesting, especially maybe in a non-language learning class, like an English class, to offer the different translations in a choice-based reading format. So I don't know if this is as common outside the UK. It's pretty common in the States, but to allow students to work in groups of 2 or 3, and each group out of your class of 35 or 40 will have a different book. So if they, in those groups, were working with different translations, but still had the opportunity to discuss as a whole class what they were reading, I think they could get a lot of benefit out of that, understanding some of the nuance of translation, but also just interpreting the story in different ways and sharing their learning without needing to read all the different translations individually. As far as the text itself, reading the different versions again really helped the translation. The likelihood that most students, even many students, will get to a point with Latin or virtually in Latin that they could read the Aeneid and have a very deep and nuanced understanding. It's not very likely for most students. So giving them that chance to increase their understanding by giving them access to multiple translations and seeing multiple facets of the story could really help them to put those together themselves. And then nuancing their understanding of culture and translation. Where I taught in the States was in a very, very rural area. It was almost all white students. Most of them worked on farms, some kind of agricultural work. And so they had a very, for the most part, closed view of the world and how things are and how things should be. And I really enjoyed the way that the Odyssey was sort of a safe space for them to explore different ways of looking at things, even just down to that simple aspect of, we call Odysseus a hero, but that idea of like what a hero means and what a hero is can be so different and be valuable in different ways in different cultures. And in terms of the Aeneid, students understood that Aeneas was this complex character who could do really good things, but also really bad things. And one of my students in this study said, "Oh, well, it's such a mood whenever Aeneas was like, whoa, why would those people want to have to go through life again? Like, why would you want to live twice?" Um, so, having that chance for them to sort of see things from different lenses and interpret some of these different ideas and views on life. And then finally, I think that you could actually use different translations to remove some of the legwork of pre-teaching. So again, if they know who Cerberus is, instead of jumping straight into translation and cutting the idea of Cerberus out, if you allowed them to read those translations first and gave them that taster and drew on some of their cultural knowledge that they have from modern retellings of those myths, or even from the Aeneid, then they would have a lot of foundation to work off of from that. So again, this is sort of my interpretation based on my teaching experience and then my experience working with these particular students with the text. And it may not, definitely isn't universally applicable, but my hope was kind of that other teachers or others who make materials for teachers would be able to draw something from it that would be beneficial in their classrooms, especially.